Frank Hyder is a well-known, renowned visual artist. When he started to become an artist, he thought the journey would be a straightforward progression. Over the years, he has discovered that the road has many twists and turns, numerous hills and valleys, and countless challenges. Through this series of short stories, tales, and remembrances, his hope is that these will offer some valuable insight into the life of an artist and what's involved in becoming an artist. In the end, he has come to realize that he is not a painter or sculptor or anything in particular. He is more simply a creative person with great passion and love for the process of making art concerning people and the world around us, who shares his artworks with the public. Join us now as we listen to another episode of A Life in Art series.
In 2008, I was beginning to develop some relationships I had started with a group of Cuban artists in Miami, Florida. I had come to Florida in Miami for the first time in 2004, and over a period of those 3 or 4 years, I had met a number of artists who actually lived and worked in Miami and became more and more familiar with just simply their surrounding and their interest in what they were up to. In 2008, one of them called me and asked me if I would like to be part of a project that they were coming up with, which was to create inflatable sculpture. Now, first of all, I had never been a sculptor per se, nor had I ever made an inflatable. I didn't really have any idea what an inflatable was, but I said yes without even hesitation, and then set about trying to learn as much as I could about what inflatable sculpture could be, what it looked like, etc. And as I explored it, I discovered there was a tradition of inflatable sculpture. Of course, everyone's familiar with the Macy's Day Parade figures and some of the outcroppings from that kind of art. But what I was interested in was some of the ways that inflatable sculpture had begun to be used in the 1970s to explore novel ways of presenting sculpture. Because it was lightweight, it could exist in the air above a site, etc. So I was certainly drawn to it. So I spent a few weeks trying to come up with a design that I felt would satisfy the goals of the assignment, which was to make an inflatable sculpture, and secondly, something that would relate to my work that I could see some possibility in. And in the end, I came up with a standing figure with outstretched arms, not unlike the figure of Christ that overlooks the harbor in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And using simplified forms, I was able to kind of create this image. I sent my paper maquette down to Miami, and then when I was notified that the piece was ready and we were going to be mounting a show, we drove down from Philadelphia to get involved with the setting up of the show. The group of artists, there were 10 of them, the majority of them were Cuban, and the group was known as Giants in the City. And our first installation took place on Biscayne Bay, in a place called the Bayside Park. And so we had these 10 big sculptures, of which, as soon as I saw my sculpture, I was at once excited and delighted. And also, as I saw all the other sculptures, I realized all the things that I hadn't thought about that I could yet explore. So it was all positive. We put up our sculpture, and then the Miami Herald came out and took photographs of several of the pieces, and the morning of the opening of Art Basel, there was my sculpture on the front page of the Miami Herald, which gave me quite an upbeat feeling about the whole process. And after the showing on Bayfront, I got the opportunity to take the sculpture to Caracas, where I displayed it in an art fair in Caracas. And after the art fair, I took it to the Andes Mountains, and I went from village to village and would set this 30-foot sculpture up in the center of the town. No one knew I was coming. It would just attract a lot of people. And then when they would come there, we would get a photograph around the sculpture, and I would talk about what was going on with the ideas of art in extended beyond the walls of museums, etc. So I was committed to these big forms, and each year for the next 3 years, I would make a large sculpture. I would put a lot of time into designing it, and then I'd send my paper maquette to Miami, and I would get this product that would come back from usually a workshop in Mexico. And there was really a lot of variation in the quality, and I was rarely very much satisfied with the quality of the product. So, and that then what I had one last tool in my toolbox, which was I could paint the objects. And so the couple of sculptures that I was unhappy with, I just took out my paintbrush and began to add painting to it, and I found that I could take the piece to another place altogether. So it was a combination of painting and sculpture, which was really pretty much my milieu. So I then was asked to be part of an exhibition that took place in Beacon, New York, at the Kube Art Center, which is owned and operated by Ethan Cohen from New York City. I had met Ethan Cohen in New York when I was included in an exhibition of a selected group of graduates from the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, which was being shown in Ethan's gallery in New York. There were 18 artists, of which I was one, and they selected a large wooden head that I had made of Trayvon Martin, and a small carved wooden self-portrait, which they seemed to like quite a bit. And so in Beacon, I was offered the opportunity to show my inflatable sculptures. I also made 7 by 12-foot paintings, which I hung over windows in this big exhibition space. And again, picking up on some of my other experiments with light going through painted surfaces with plants and things like that. So, but the inflatables, I brought 4 inflatables, and they placed 3 outside and 1 inside the exhibition space. And they were really well received, and it was a pretty serious exhibition. So I had a moment where Ethan Cohen took me aside, and he sat me down and asked me a number of questions about the pieces I was making, and it was really clear to me that he was interested in what I was doing. It was also really clear to me that he had a number of questions that I didn't have answers for. So taking that thought, when I returned to Miami, I was convinced that if I wanted to do more with this inflatable sculpture, I needed to rethink some of my premises and be able to answer some of the questions that Ethan had asked me. Certainly one of the questions Ethan asked me was how much control I could have over the outcome of one of the pieces. How reliable was it? Could I produce them in addition? These were all questions I didn't have answers for. So when I came back to Miami, I started to do a lot of research, and I discovered there was a company in Miami called Inflatable Concepts. And what they did is they made big inflatables for rock concerts, for special events. They were very sophisticated. So I gave them a call, and I went down to their shop and had a conversation with them. And we went through some of the issues that I was concerned about, and I agreed to let them make a piece for me. And the first thing they made for me was a whale that was about 10 feet tall. And the basic shape, I gave them a drawing. I discussed what I wanted to have happening with the drawing. And then they made this piece, which when I saw it, immediately it looked exactly like the drawing that I had made, and it had a whole bunch of issues that were incorporated in its solution that I had not previously been able to control, just in terms of the logistics of where the inflators went and how you assembled the piece and disassembled the piece, inflated it or deflated it, etc. And so I then made a second piece with him, and that piece also turned out successful. And I saw a lot more potential in what I could get from them than what I had been making before. The other thing that I was doing was I had changed the scale of the pieces. Instead of going to 30 feet, I had dropped down to 10 and 12 feet scale, which was big enough, but it was small enough that you could get them into an exhibition space, which is one of the things that I discovered in Beacon. They were so big they had to be outside. And I was aware of the fact that there were a couple of artists working in Europe and in Asia who were making inflatables on a gigantic scale, and I wasn't afraid that I couldn't make pieces like that. I just didn't have the financial support that it requires to make those oversized pieces. So I decided to stay within a scale of which I could personally afford to fund. So anyway, that was pretty much where I had gotten to that point. And then at almost that same moment, I was approached by my gallery in London, which had come to me with the idea of participating in a show in New York City sponsored by the Fabergé company. So I agreed that I thought it would be a terrific thing to do. There were 260 artists, most of which were really pretty well known. And what would happen then was each artist was given a large egg, a fiberglass egg that was about 3 feet tall. And so we could do whatever we wanted with the egg. We could cut it, we could paint it, we could build on it, we could do whatever. And so I took my egg home, and I applied a texture to it, ended up gold leafing it, and then painting on top of that. And I returned the piece to them in New York. They were so happy with the piece that it was selected to be exhibited at the Saatchi studio. And then the New York Times took a photograph of it and printed it in color in the Sunday Times. And it was selected for exhibition at Central Park in front of the boathouse, where it stood for a month, and finally was one of only 40 pieces out of the 260 that were selected to be auctioned off at Sotheby's. So I looked at that and I said, well, there's something about that form, that shape, that obviously resonates with people. And I had that in my thoughts as I had been invited to do a 30-day residency in Polynesia as an artist in residence on a cruise ship called the Marina for the Oceania Cruise Line. And so I was on the ship for 30 days. They gave me a studio, and I would work in the studio. And every 10 days or so, the ship passengers would change and a new group would come. And then we'd sort of sail around Polynesia, and then the people would get off and we'd turn around and go back the way we came, and reverse the course. So when I was doing that, during that time, people were coming into the studio and they were looking at what I was painting and talking to me. And I began to notice that a lot of people were referring to a racial problem that we were having in the U.S. And I was really sort of startled by that. I didn't quite connect with that. I didn't understand where that was coming from. And of course, Barack Obama was the president at the time, and I didn't realize the energy that Fox News had been putting into creating the idea that Obama was actually the enemy of the people. And but these Cruz people all seemed very clear about Fox being on the right track. Well, anyway, needless to say, when I left Polynesia, the ship left and sailed to Lima, Peru, and I stayed on board as we crossed the Pacific. One of the things we did was we stopped at Easter Island. So we spent 2 days at Easter Island, in which I got off and was exploring the island. They have over 800 of these big heads all over the island, and everywhere I went, I was looking at them, and I began to get the germ of an idea. And the idea was I really wanted to make a big head that was somewhat inspired by these figures on Easter Island. So when I returned to my studio in Miami, I began drawing, and I started with the egg shape that was left over from my project with Fabergé. And as I began to modify the egg and give it this face that was somewhat loosely based on the Easter Island figures, I began to get happier and happier with what was happening on the paper. But I found one side, having the face, left me with the other side of the egg just being a flat surface. And I said, I really wanted to do something with that. So I just flipped it and added another face to the other side, which I liked immediately. And as I saw it, I also recognized that it represented a form that I was familiar with from the history of art called a Janus. And the Romans had invented this figure, Janus, who was the god of new beginnings. We get the word January from his name, etc. And so I did some reading on Janus. I did some thinking about it, and I decided that this was a place where I could make a statement that reflected my point of view on this racial situation that a lot of people had been telling me about during my residency. So what I did was I divided the head in half, and one face I made sort of a soft orangey color, like a skin type color, and the other side I made black. And what I wanted to do was simply say, it doesn't matter what color the skin is, that we all come from the same egg. There's only one race, not any 4 or 3 or 2 or anything. It's just one race called the human race, out of which we come. We may not all look the same, but we all share that genetic connector. And so I then went to the Inflatable Concepts people with this idea, and I gave them my drawings, which they then translated into a 3D program, and proceeded to create the very first of what I would go to call the Janus figures. Now, I wanted to remove gender from the issue, and the Romans used the word Janus with a US, and I knew that if I got rid of the US, it would remove the gender, so I made it an IS, so it's a Janus. And I didn't want it to be a female or a male, so what I did was I gave it earrings on one side, and on the other side, I kept it kind of plain. I didn't give it facial hair, and I tried not to give it a look of a man or a woman. And anyway, it took about 3 weeks for the piece to be finally made. And when I went down to Inflatable Concepts to pick it up and we inflated it for the first time, I was absolutely ecstatic, because just in its raw structure, without any paint added to it at all, I was really quite excited. I think that it was the first time I had made one of these sculptures that really satisfied all of my issues and really produced something that I felt had a real authority and a real presence. So I brought the sculpture back to my studio, and it sat in my studio for 2 or 3 weeks as I explored what to do with it next. Ultimately, I ended up painting, adding some stripes to it, painting eyes on it, and adding some color to both sides. And I found that I was rather pleased with the outcome. quite accidentally, I was in contact with Alan Edmonds in Philadelphia, who ran the Brandywine Archive and Press, and I shared an image of it, and Alan asked me, would that piece be able to come to Philadelphia? And I said, yes, we could. So he said, well, let's set up a time and we'll do an installation of it in front of the Brandywine building on Broad Street, which I said, yeah, that's perfect. Let's do it. And at the same time, the people at the cruise line who had done set up all my booking for my trip to Polynesia, I shared a photograph of it with them, and they asked me, could I take that on a ship? And I said, sure, it could go on a ship. And so over a period of a couple of weeks, we began to plan the idea that I would take the ship up on its offer and take the piece to Europe. And we're working with the people in the office. We set up a 3-month tour where I would go from 3 different ships, and each destination they would go to, I would set up this Janus sculpture and get some photographs, and I would move it around and put it in different places and get some interaction with people. And I was beginning to build a notion about extending the gallery or extending the art space beyond the studio, beyond the museum, beyond the art gallery, and putting art directly in the street. And then everywhere I was, I would have the opportunity to get into a conversation with people about what did the sculpture mean? Why was it there? What was I doing there? Etc. And of course, I was doing this without proper notice, without permits, and it led at times to some interactions with police and officials who were not terribly eager to see me there with the piece. But by and large, the response was fabulous, and I was just teeming with ideas, and I immediately made plans to make 3 or 4 more of these sculptures, because I could see the opportunity of showing them in various places. And I also began to receive invitations to take them places. So I said, well, if I have more than one, I can use them in different ways at different times. So anyway, that was how I got started with the Janus project and the Janus figures. I called it the Janus project because I wanted it to be more expansive than a single piece. Even though I didn't know where I was going to go with it, I just sensed that I had an idea now that could be expanded upon. And so I started out with a single inflatable, and now in a few months I had 4 of them. Then I began to think about scale. Do they have to be 10 or 12 feet tall? Could they be 8 feet tall? Could I do different things? And over the next couple of years, eventually I had produced somewhere in the area of 25 of these figures in sizes from 4 feet tall up to 12 feet tall, and a variety of shape. I didn't change the form much. What I did do was change the design of how they were decorated or painted. And I added lighting elements on the inside. I experimented with sound elements. And from all of these, during the time of working with these, I had an accident. I was hit by a car and both of my legs were broken. And so I was not able to stand. I was seated in a chair. And while seated, I began to work on a clay model of my sculpture that was only about 1 foot tall. And my goal was to get this piece so that I could make a mold and learn to teach myself how to cast them in fiberglass. So while I was doing that, and at the same time, because I couldn't stand, I began to make watercolor paintings of my sculptures set up in public spaces. And I realized that watercolor was a process that I had learned how to do many years early, but I had not really done much with in recent time. And now I began to make watercolors in every size from 8 by 10 inches up to 4 by 5 feet, and explore. I was combining my own images, creating original images of my sculpture exhibited in different places and with people interacting with the sculpture. And I began to have really take a lot of liberty and have a lot of fun. And I was enjoying painting. I was working in the sculpture at the same time and beginning to learn how to make these pieces in fiberglass. From the fiberglass, I met a Frenchman in Miami who was a mold maker, whose father had been the mold maker for Miro, the Spanish master, whose grandfather had worked for the master Auguste Rodin in Paris, and whose great-grandfather had made the molds for the Statue of Liberty. And Olivier began to work with me making molds and building fiberglass structures. So we made molds to make big 5-foot-tall fiberglass sculptures. Building on that, taking those molds, I went to a bronze foundry and we cast them in wax, which they then made bronzes from. So this little idea that had sort of come to me in a very sort of almost offhanded way by being invited to participate in a single event had now become the center of my work and my production, and was leading me into new avenues. And I've continued to explore, most recently making them in cement and permanently installing one at the Kube Foundation in Beacon, New York, the place where I exhibited the inflatables for pretty much the first time, the place where I had gotten asked questions which led me to go back and look into the manufacture and process that I was using. And so I had seen a kind of a full circle of events that took place over a course of about 8 years. And it seemed to me once again that I followed the work. The work led me to new places. I did the things that the work demanded, and that led me as an artist to another level. Each time I was growing as the work was developing, and in the end, the inseparable nature of being the person who makes something. And I didn't really have a plan when I started, but the plan was evolving in front of me as I was reacting to the instances and circumstances I found myself in.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions or suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to Frank Hyder on Facebook or Instagram. We hope to see you at one of the next A Life in Art episodes.